Long-distance trade in ancient Mesopotamia was built on a fundamental lie. Caravans crossed deserts and rivers carrying fortunes in goods, yet the merchant sending them could never truly trust the person delivering them. Fraud was not just a risk, it was the default expectation, a constant threat from both common thieves and the imperial tax collectors themselves. This is the story of the ingenious physical object invented to solve that impossible problem, the clay envelope known as a bulla. By the end, you will understand how this simple lump of mud became the world's first secure contract, a device that built trust across continents and secretly gave birth to the very idea of written records. We will uncover how a system designed to stop caravan drivers from stealing also became the tool that kept entire empires from crumbling into financial chaos. What does it take to build an economy when you cannot believe a single word anyone says? This world of fragile trust first emerged from a landscape of mud and marsh. In the Fertile Crescent between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, something unprecedented was happening. Villages swelled into the world's first true cities, like Uruk and Their populations exploded into the tens of thousands, a scale of human cooperation never before seen. But these cities were built on a geographical paradox. The land was phenomenally rich for growing barley and dates, yet it was utterly barren of almost everything else needed for civilization. There was no stone for foundations, no metals for tools, and certainly no tall timber for beams and roofs. Everything a city required to grow beyond simple mud huts had to come from somewhere else. This created a desperate, driving need. To build, they had to trade. And to trade, they had to send people on journeys that stretched for hundreds of miles across mountains and deserts, into lands they did not control. From this logistical nightmare, a new kind of person was born, not a farmer or a soldier, but the merchant. These individuals became the lifeblood of the empire, venturing out with grain and woven cloth to bargain for cedar wood from the distant Levant, for copper from Anatolia, for precious lapis lazuli from far-off Afghanistan. They operated in a silent world, a world without instant communication, without maps as we know them, and crucially, without any police force or international law to protect them. A merchant's entire fortune and the city's vital supplies were placed in the hands of a caravan driver and entrusted to the emptiness of the desert. So how could a merchant in sleep at night, knowing his agent was weeks away with a fortune in uncut stone? The answer would not be written on parchment, but molded from the very earth beneath their feet. The merchant's dilemma was one of pure, agonizing distance. Picture a trade deal struck in the bustling docks of A shipment of fine textiles is exchanged for a promise of copper ingots to be delivered months later from a mountain mine hundreds of miles to the north. The merchant gives his goods to a caravan driver, a man he may never see again. There are no contracts to sign, no phones to call, no way to verify a story from the other side of a mountain range. The system ran on nothing but fragile human memory and a hope for honesty, a hope that history tells us was often misplaced. A carrier could easily claim bandits stole half the load, or that the buyer never paid, pocketing the difference himself. The buyer, in turn, could deny receiving the full amount, leaving the seller with a devastating loss. In this vast silence, fraud was not just easy, it was almost inevitable. The entire engine of civilization was at risk of seizing up from a simple lack of proof. Their first attempt at a solution was beautifully simple, yet deeply flawed. Before writing was invented, they used tokens. These were small, shaped pieces of clay, each one representing a specific commodity. A cone might stand for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a jar of oil, a cylinder for a single sheep. To record a transaction, the concerned parties would gather the correct tokens and seal them inside a hollow clay ball. Once the ball dried, it became a physical, unchangeable record of the deal. You could shake the bulla and hear the tokens rattling inside, a literal accounting of what was owed or delivered. It was clever, a three-dimensional receipt. But its weakness was as physical as its strength. If a dispute arose, the only way to verify the contents was to break the clay ball open, and once broken, the record was destroyed. The agreement could never be checked again by a third party, like a temple official or a city governor. This was a system built for a handshake deal, not for the complex, multi-layered economy of an empire. The tokens were a secret between the maker and the breaker, and in that secrecy lay the seed of distrust. The empire needed a record that could speak without being shattered, a receipt that could be witnessed by countless eyes across both space and time. The solution would not come from reinventing the token, but from imprinting its message onto the very skin of the world. The system of tokens was a language of objects, a silent code understood across the bustling markets of Mesopotamia. A small clay cone did not just look like a cone, it meant one specific measure of barley. A smooth sphere represented a jar of precious oil. A disc with a cross etched on its surface could stand for a single sheep. To record a sale or a debt, the parties would gather the corresponding tokens and press them into a soft lump of clay, creating a kind of three-dimensional ledger. This physical bundle was the agreement, but its simplicity hid a vulnerability that threatened every transaction. These tokens were not secured in any meaningful way. A dishonest caravan driver, entrusted with a bag of them representing a fortune in grain, could simply remove a few cones and claim the original shipment was smaller. The buyer receiving the shipment could just as easily claim extra tokens were missing, insisting they were shortchanged. There was no independent record, no way to prove what the original set contained. The entire promise existed only in those loose, portable pieces of clay, vulnerable to loss, to alteration, or to simple, confident lies. In a dispute, it became a contest of memory and reputation, with the truth buried somewhere in the dust of the road. The economy needed something the tokens alone could never provide, a form of proof that was permanent, unchangeable, and visible to authority. The breakthrough would come not from discarding the tokens, but from locking their message in plain sight. This vulnerability created a pressure cooker of distrust, a problem demanding a physical solution, and the solution emerged from the same material that built their cities, the endless clay of the riverbanks. Someone, a merchant or perhaps a temple scribe tired of endless disputes, had a flash of pure genius. They took the loose collection of tokens representing a shipment and did something radical. Instead of just carrying them, they pressed the entire set into a larger, fist-sized lump of wet clay. Then they carefully folded that clay around the tokens, encasing them completely, and pinched the edges shut. In that simple act, the world's first envelope was born. This sealed clay ball, called a bulla, transformed everything. The tokens were no longer loose and temptingly adjustable. They were now locked inside a hardened clay shell, a secure, tamper-evident container. To see what the deal contained, you would have to break the bulla open, an act that would be immediately obvious and would destroy the record itself. This created a powerful deterrent. A caravan driver could no longer quietly remove a token representing a jar of oil. The merchant receiving the shipment could no longer claim tokens were missing. The truth was physically sealed inside, a silent witness, but the innovation did not stop there. While the clay was still soft, the parties would roll their personal cylinder seals across the surface. These carved stone seals, unique to each individual, acted like a signature and a corporate logo combined. Their intricate patterns, pressed into the clay, identified who made the agreement and served as a solemn vow. The outside of the bulla now told a story of its own, displaying the seals of the merchant, the carrier, and often a temple or palace official as a witness. The inside held the immutable truth of the transaction. For the first time, a promise could travel across deserts, held in the hand of a stranger, and remain verifiably intact. It was a system of trust built not on goodwill but on brilliant, unforgiving physics. But a sealed clay ball was only half the answer. Its true power came from the intricate marks pressed into its surface. Before the bulla hardened, each person involved in the agreement would take out their most prized possession, not a jewel or a coin, but a cylinder seal. These were small, beautifully carved stone cylinders, often made of hematite or lapis lazuli, each one unique to its owner. The seal was more than just a decorative object. It was a person's legal identity carved in stone. To authorize the deal, a merchant would roll his seal firmly across the soft clay of the bulla. As it turned, it would leave behind a continuous, raised impression of its intricate design. This might show a scene of gods, heroic battles, or simply geometric patterns and the owner's name in cuneiform script. That impression was an unforgeable signature. It declared, "This agreement was made by me, and I stand by it." The caravan driver would add his own seal, accepting responsibility for the goods. Often, a third seal from a temple scribe or a palace official would also be pressed into the clay, acting as an official witness. Suddenly, the outside of the bulla told a complete story. Anyone could look at it and see exactly who was bound by the contract inside without ever breaking it open. It was a public declaration of a private promise. This system turned a simple lump of clay into a portable courtroom. The seals provided accountability, linking every transaction directly to specific individuals and the institutions that backed them. If a driver later claimed bandits stole the goods, his seal was right there on the bulla he himself had authorized, tying him irrevocably to the original count. The seal made fraud a personal and very traceable risk. This sealed clay ball now became the caravan driver's most important cargo, even more vital than the sacks of grain or bundles of cloth he guarded. His responsibility was twofold, a physical and a legal duty. He had to deliver the actual goods, of course, but just as crucially, he had to deliver the unbroken bulla. This lump of clay was his proof of work, his legally binding receipt. It traveled with him, perhaps tucked safely in a leather pouch, a constant, tangible reminder of the promise he was hired to fulfill. He could not open it. He had no need to open it. His entire role was one of pure transport. The tokens inside represented the exact count and type of goods he was given, and the seals on the outside were the signatures of the men who gave them to him. His integrity and his payment depended on delivering that sealed truth intact. Imagine him arriving at a distant city's warehouse, the journey complete. He would present both the goods and the hard clay sphere to the waiting merchant. They would inspect the bulla together, checking that the familiar seal impressions were still clear and unbroken. The outside told them who sent it and who carried it, but the real agreement, the specific details of the deal, remained a secret held securely inside the clay. Only if something went terribly wrong, only if the receiving merchant disputed the amount or the type of goods, would they take the drastic step of breaking the bulla open to reveal the tokens within. This was the system's brilliant equilibrium. The carrier's honesty was enforced by a simple, physical fact. A broken bulla meant a broken contract, and the blame would fall squarely on the last person to possess it. The moment of delivery was a tense, formal ceremony. The caravan driver, dusty and weary from the road, would stand before the merchant who had commissioned the goods. Between them, on a table or perhaps a simple cloth on the ground, sat the unbroken clay bulla and the physical shipment it represented. This was not a casual handover. Witnesses would be present, often other merchants or local officials, their presence turning the exchange into a public event. all eyes would be on that hardened sphere of clay. The recipient would carefully inspect the exterior, confirming the seal impressions were exactly as they should be, the unique patterns of the sender and the carrier clear and undisturbed. This was the final checkpoint before the truth was revealed. With the witnesses watching, the merchant would then take the bulla and deliberately break it open. The crack of the clay would be a sharp, definitive sound. Inside, the collection of tokens would spill out, each one a tiny, shaped promise, a cone for a measure of barley, a sphere for a jar of oil. The recipient and the witnesses would then perform the crucial verification. They would count the tokens one by one, and then compare that count directly to the actual goods that had just arrived. Did the number of grain sacks match the number of cone tokens? Did the jars of oil correspond to the spheres? This was the system's ultimate test. If everything matched perfectly, it was a moment of profound relief and validated trust. The carrier had done his job with integrity. The transaction was complete, and the broken pieces of the clay envelope their purpose served were often simply discarded. But what if the counts did not align? If there were fewer goods than tokens, a serious problem was exposed. The broken bulla itself became the central piece of evidence. Since the carrier's seal was pressed into its outer surface, and the bulla had only been broken now in front of witnesses, the responsibility was undeniable. The carrier could not claim the shortage happened after he delivered it. The physical evidence pointed directly back to him. This elegant, brutal logic made fraud a tremendous personal risk. The system did not rely on vague accusations or faulty memories. It created a moment of undeniable physical truth, transforming a simple trade into a verifiable fact and holding individuals accountable in a way that echoed across the silent distances of the ancient world. But this system of sealed clay balls solved more than just disputes between merchants. Its true revolutionary impact was felt by the most powerful institutions in the land, the temples and the royal palaces. These were not just religious or political centers, they were the economic engines of the entire civilization. They owned vast estates, employed thousands, and funded everything from city walls to grand irrigation canals. And their primary source of wealth was not trade but taxation. Across the empire, from bustling river ports to remote farming villages, officials collected taxes not in coins but in kind. A farmer would pay with a portion of his barley harvest, a herder would pay with sheep, a weaver would pay with bolts of linen. This river of wealth, flowing from the countryside into the granaries and storerooms of the capital, was the lifeblood of the state. And it presented a fraud problem of unimaginable scale. A local tax collector, a day's journey from the capital, could easily skim from the top, claiming a village yield was lower than it truly was. A warehouse overseer in the city could report that stored grain had spoiled, diverting it for his own profit. With no independent record, the central authority was blind. They had to trust a chain of officials they could never personally watch, across distances they could not quickly travel. The potential for loss was not just a business setback, it was an existential threat to the empire itself. If the treasury emptied, armies could not be paid, famine relief could not be organized, and the entire complex structure of civilization could falter. The genius of the clay envelope was about to be scaled up to protect an empire. The palace's vulnerability was staggering in its simplicity. A single dishonest official in a distant province could quietly drain the empire's lifeblood, one sack of grain at a time. Picture the annual tax collection in a farming village along the Euphrates. The local assessor, acting on behalf of the king, would survey the barley fields. His tally would determine the village obligation, a portion of its harvest owed to the central granaries. He would then oversee the collection, watching as villagers poured their grain into large, standard-sized jars for transport. Here, the temptation and the opportunity collided. The assessor could easily order an extra jar filled for himself, simply lowering the official count he reported upstream. Or when the loaded donkeys finally arrived at the massive palace storehouse days later, the receiving steward could claim several jars had broken open on the journey, their contents lost, while quietly redirecting the grain to his own network. In both cases, the same devastating question arose: who could prove what the original assessment truly was? The farmer knew he paid more. The assessor's record said he collected less. The palace steward's inventory showed even less had arrived, with no common, unchangeable record linking all 3 points in the chain. The truth evaporated into a cloud of conflicting claims and unverifiable stories. The empire was being bled dry by the very silence it had created, a silence that the humble clay Bulla was uniquely designed to shatter. The empire's solution was to turn every tax shipment into a sealed, verifiable package. Here is how it worked step by step. When the royal assessor arrived in a village to collect the grain tax, his first task was to count. He would not just estimate, he would physically measure the harvest, determining the exact number of standard jars the village owed. For each jar of grain due, he would take a specific clay token, perhaps a small disc, and place it to the side. This pile of tokens became the official, physical record of the tax debt. He then pressed these tokens into a lump of wet clay and sealed them inside a bulla. But this was no ordinary merchant's agreement. Before sealing it, he would roll his own official cylinder seal across the clay, and often the seal of the local village elder as a witness, creating an indisputable record of what was collected, right there at the source. This sealed clay ball was not given to the farmer. It was handed to the official responsible for transporting the grain to the palace. The bulla and the grain shipment were now inseparable. The transporter could not claim a lower yield. He was now in possession of both the physical goods and the sealed, authoritative count of those goods, a count he had no way to alter. His job was simply to deliver both intact to the central granary. Upon arrival, the palace steward would not just accept the grain, he would demand the bulla. In a formal ceremony with other officials present, he would inspect the unbroken seals, confirming they were the correct ones from the distant assessor and the village. Then and only then would he break the clay sphere open. The tokens inside would spill onto a table. The steward would count them one by one, and then immediately verify that count against the actual jars of grain just unloaded from the donkeys. If the numbers matched perfectly, the transaction was validated. The tax had been delivered in full. The system created a perfect chain of custody. The assessor in the field was accountable for the count he made. The transporter was accountable for delivering that exact amount. The palace steward was accountable for receiving it. Fraud at any point became nearly impossible because the truth was locked inside a simple ball of clay, created at the beginning of the journey and only opened at its final destination. This was more than accounting, it was the invention of bureaucratic transparency. The clay envelope allowed the central state to see, with certainty, what was happening in its most remote provinces, closing the vast distance with a technology of pure physical proof. These silent clay spheres did not vanish with the empires that created them. Their story is written not on fragile parchment, but in the enduring earth itself, waiting for archaeologists to piece it together. At ancient sites across the Middle East, from the great city of Uruk to the administrative centers of Susa and Habuba Kabera, excavators have made a curious discovery. They have unearthed thousands of these small, hardened clay lumps, some perfectly intact, many more shattered into fragments. To an untrained eye, they might look like nothing more than ancient rubbish, broken bits of pottery or shapeless mud. But to a researcher, each one is a frozen moment in time, a physical receipt from a transaction that occurred over 5,000 years ago. The intact bullae, still sealed, represent promises that were never fulfilled or perhaps were simply filed away and forgotten. Their unbroken surfaces still bear the crisp impressions of cylinder seals, the names and symbols of long-forgotten merchants and officials silently pressed into the clay. The broken pieces, however, tell the more complete story. These are the envelopes that served their purpose. They were cracked open in those tense moments of verification, their tokens counted and matched, the deal confirmed. Once their internal truth was revealed, the hollow clay shells were discarded, tossed into trash pits, or simply swept into the corners of storerooms. This archaeological record is breathtakingly direct. We are not reading a later historian's account of how trade worked. We are holding the very objects that made it work. The sheer volume of these finds, the countless broken halves, testifies to a system operating on an immense daily scale. Every fragment is a tiny monument to a problem solved, a moment where trust was not given, but mechanically and brilliantly engineered. Yet the most profound innovation was not the envelope itself, but the accidental record it began to leave behind. In the daily rush of commerce and tax collection, a simple shortcut emerged, one that would quietly revolutionize human communication. Instead of just dropping the tokens into the hollow clay ball, a busy scribe might first press them firmly into the flat surface of the wet clay slab he was about to fold. He would push a cone-shaped token in to mark a measure of grain, a sphere for oil, leaving a clear, sunken impression. Then, while those marks were still wet, he would fold the clay over the tokens themselves and seal the edges, creating the bulla. This small change in routine had a monumental consequence. When that bulla was later broken open for verification, the tokens would tumble out as usual. But now something new remained. On the inside surface of the shattered clay shell, now lying flat, were the perfect negative impressions of those very tokens. The cone left a triangular hole, the sphere left a circular depression. These were not the objects but their signatures. For the first time, the information was no longer locked inside the object, it was imprinted onto a surface. The system now had a built-in backup, a ghostly image of the agreement that survived the breaking of the seal. This was the moment the three-dimensional world of objects began its flattening into the two-dimensional world of symbols. The token was becoming obsolete, but its meaning was finding a new and far more powerful home. That ghostly imprint on the inside of the broken clay shell was far more than a simple shortcut. It was a conceptual earthquake. For the first time in human history, a physical transaction left behind a permanent, independent memory of itself. The tokens could be taken out and reused for the next deal, as they always had been. But now something remained. The hollow halves of the bulla, often discarded on the floor, held within them the perfect negative shapes of the agreement, a lasting impression of the promise that had just been fulfilled. This was the genius of the system's own waste product. It meant the record was no longer locked away inside the object. It was etched onto a surface for anyone to see, even years later. A temple official could now pick up a broken bulla fragment and immediately read its story, the triangular indentations declaring so many measures of grain, the circular hollows confirming jars of oil, all without a single token in sight. The information had been liberated from the object and transferred to a medium that could be archived, compared, and studied. This was the quiet, accidental birth of the document. They had not set out to invent writing, they were simply trying to make their accounting more efficient. But in pressing tokens into clay before sealing them, they stumbled upon a principle that would change everything, the principle that a symbol could stand in for a thing, and that symbol could be fixed in place, creating a permanent memory outside of the human mind. The world of three-dimensional things was beginning its great flattening into the world of two-dimensional data, and it all started with the impression left behind in a piece of discarded mud. The discarded clay shell held a revelation. Someone, perhaps a sharp-eyed scribe tired of sweeping up broken bullae, looked at those hollow halves with their sunken impressions and saw something others had missed. This was not just debris, it was a record. The triangular holes, the circular hollows, they told the exact same story as the tokens that had been inside them, but in a new and more permanent form. All the information was right there, etched in negative space on a flat, durable surface. In a flash of pragmatic genius, they skipped a step. Why go through the trouble of sealing tokens inside a ball, just to break it open and read the impressions left behind? Why not simply press the tokens directly into a flat slab of clay from the very beginning? With that simple shift in thinking, the hollow Bulla shell transformed. It unfolded, both literally and conceptually, into the world's first clay tablet. This was not an invention from scratch, it was an evolution. The need for a secure, verifiable record birthed the envelope, and the envelope's own broken remains gave birth to the document. The three-dimensional accounting system collapsed perfectly into 2 dimensions. Now, a scribe could take a smooth, palm-sized rectangle of wet clay, press his cone token into it to mark a shipment of grain, press a sphere for oil, and then set the tablet aside to dry. The transaction was recorded instantly in a format that could be filed on a shelf, handed to a messenger, or presented to a governor without ever being destroyed. The token was no longer the record, it was the tool for making the record. The impression it left behind became the true and lasting word. Writing, in its most fundamental sense, began not as poetry or history, but as hardened mud holding the shape of a promise. That flattened piece of clay was now a canvas, but the marks pressed into it were still just pictures of things. A triangular hole was a picture of a grain token. A circular hollow was a picture of an oil token. The system was still bound to the physical world of objects it represented, but necessity, as always, pushed for greater speed and clarity. A scribe making dozens of these tablets a day would grow tired of fetching the actual stone or clay tokens for every single entry. He needed a faster way to make the same mark. So he picked up a sharpened reed, a stylus, and instead of pressing a token, he simply used the tip of the reed to carve the shape of that token's impression directly into the wet clay. He would push the stylus in at an angle to create a wedge shape for the old cone token's triangular mark. He would press the end of the reed to make a circular indentation for the sphere. This was the quiet, practical moment where drawing replaced imprinting. The scribe was no longer copying an object, he was writing a symbol. The token itself could stay in its box. Its meaning had been fully transferred to a sign made by hand. This was the birth of true notation, the moment the system broke free from the library of physical tokens and created its own visual language. The most important signs to emerge from this shift were the ones for numbers, because in the end, everything in that economy boiled down to counts and measures. The old token for a small measure of grain, a cone, left a wedge-shaped impression. That wedge, carefully drawn with a stylus, became the cuneiform sign for the number 1 in the context of grain. A different token, perhaps a sphere, representing a larger unit like a jar of oil, evolved into a circular sign made by pressing the end of the reed. Now a scribe could record not just what something was, but exactly how much of it there was, using a standardized set of numerical signs that any trained person could read. The envelope had created the need for a permanent surface. The tablet provided that surface, and the stylus, in the hands of a busy administrator, transformed memory into data. We often think of writing as beginning with stories or names, but in Mesopotamia, it began with math. The first true written words were numbers and measures, the essential code for tracking the wealth of gods and kings. The Bulla was more than a receipt, it was a working prototype for the modern contract. Think about what a contract fundamentally is. It is an agreement between identified parties with specific terms in a format that can be proven and verified by an outside authority. The clay envelope provided all three. The cylinder seals pressed into its surface were the signatures, legally identifying the merchant and the carrier. The collection of tokens sealed inside spelled out the exact terms, the quantities and types of goods involved, and the hardened, unbroken clay itself was the tamper-evident format. It allowed a third party, like a temple judge, to physically hold the entire agreement in his hand, inspect the seals for authenticity, and know that the terms inside had not been altered since the moment it was made. This portability of proof was its revolutionary power. A promise was no longer just a spoken word that faded into air, or a loose collection of items that could be secretly changed. It was now a single, secure object that could travel anywhere, from a merchant's house to a royal court, carrying its own immutable truth within it. The Bulla turned vague trust into verifiable fact, creating a legal framework from mud and seals. This sealed object created something entirely new in the ancient world, a verifiable chain of custody. Think of the Bulla as the first hyperlink in a physical audit trail. It did not just record a transaction, it actively connected every person and place involved in that transaction, forging a link that could not be secretly broken. The journey began at the point of origin, where the assessor or merchant pressed his seal into the wet clay alongside the tokens. This act permanently tied him to the specific count sealed inside. That clay ball then traveled, becoming the responsibility of the carrier, whose own seal was added, accepting the duty of transport. Finally, it arrived at its destination, where the recipient or official would break it open only in the presence of witnesses. At every single point, from creation to verification, the object itself enforced accountability. The carrier could not alter the count without breaking the seal, and a broken seal before arrival was an automatic confession of tampering. The receiving official could not claim a shortage existed before he received it, because the unbroken seal proved the contents had been secure until that very moment. This closed loop transformed a simple trade route into a transparent pipeline. For the first time, authority could flow backward along the chain. If the tokens inside did not match the goods delivered, the broken Bulla provided immediate, physical evidence pinpointing where in the chain the failure occurred. Was the assessor's original count wrong? The tokens inside would prove it. Did the carrier steal en route? The unbroken seal upon arrival would exonerate him, pointing the inquiry back to the origin. This was not about trust, it was about traceability. The system assumed human nature was fallible, and instead of pleading for honesty, it engineered a world where every action left a permanent mark in clay. It made the invisible journey of goods completely visible to the institutions that depended on them, turning the vast, silent empire into a network of auditable connections. The Bulla was, in essence, the world's first administrative tracking number, a lump of mud that could tell its own story from start to finish. Yet for all its clever engineering, the system was not foolproof. It still relied on a fragile human element. The cylinder seal was meant to be unforgeable, a unique signature carved in hard stone. But what if someone created a convincing copy? A skilled artisan with a grudge or a thief with enough time could potentially replicate the intricate patterns of a merchant's seal. If a forged seal was pressed onto a Bulla, the entire chain of trust would be built on a lie from the very start. The physical object would be perfect, but the identity it claimed would be a fiction. Even more simply, what if the entire Bulla was swapped? A dishonest caravan driver could, in theory, prepare a second, fraudulent clay ball in advance. He could seal inside it a set of tokens representing a smaller shipment, press counterfeit seals onto its surface, and then simply replace the genuine Bulla with this fake one somewhere along the lonely road. Upon delivery, the fake would be broken open, the counts would not match the actual goods, and the blame would fall on a mystery that could never be solved. The system's physical security was only as strong as the social world that surrounded it. This is where the clay met the culture. The brilliant logic of the Bulla needed a powerful deterrent to make those theoretical risks too terrifying to attempt. The penalties for fraud for breaking a sealed agreement were severe. Historical records and law codes from the era make this clear. An individual caught forging a seal or tampering with a commercial contract faced consequences far beyond a fine. They risked permanent loss of status, exile from the commercial community, or physical punishment. In a society where one's reputation and literal place in the city were everything, being marked as untrustworthy was a social and economic death sentence. The law provided a backdrop of fear, but the true enforcement was cultural. The entire economy operated on a foundation of witnessed oaths. Your seal was not just a signature, it was your word made solid, a direct extension of your honor and your family's name. To break that seal's promise was to break a sacred bond with the community and the gods who oversaw fair dealing. The system worked because everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest porter, understood that the clay envelope was more than a container, it was a covenant. The risk of being caught was high, and the cost of that failure was catastrophic. This social pressure turned the Bulla from a clever gadget into a profound symbol of order. It channeled human ambition and fallibility into a structured, accountable process, proving that the most important ingredient in any system of trust is not the technology itself, but the shared understanding that violating it carries a price too steep to pay. This covenant of clay did not remain static. The system of sealing grew more complex, mirroring the expanding bureaucracy it served. A simple agreement between two merchants was one thing, but a royal decree, a temple endowment, or a multi-party trade treaty demanded greater authority. The solution was to multiply the witnesses. Instead of just the two principal seals, a single bulla might now bear the impressions of 5, 10, or even 20 different cylinder seals. Each official who needed to approve or witness the transaction would press his own unique stone into the clay surface. This created a powerful visual hierarchy. A bulla covered in a constellation of seals was not just a contract, it was a miniature council meeting frozen in time. The more seals it bore, the greater its legal and political weight. Anyone who later held that clay ball could see at a glance the web of authority backing its contents. It was a democratic form of verification, where consensus was not just recorded, but physically embedded into the very object that represented the agreement. This practice transformed the bulla from a receipt into a portable archive of consent, ensuring that no single individual could later deny their involvement or challenge the decision without challenging the entire witnessed assembly. As the empire's records grew more detailed, the information they needed to secure began to overflow the simple language of tokens. Tokens were perfect for quantities of grain or jars of oil, but how do you seal a complex legal text, a detailed property deed, or the terms of a diplomatic marriage alliance? The Mesopotamians had begun writing such documents on new, flexible materials like papyrus or prepared leather. These scrolls held vast amounts of information, but they presented a new security nightmare. A papyrus could be altered with a stroke of a pen or replaced entirely with a forgery. The genius of the system was its adaptability. Scribes took the core principle of the bulla and scaled it up. They would write the full document on a scroll, then they would roll or fold it tightly, wrap a loop of string or cord around it many times, and finally press the ends of that string into a large lump of wet clay. Into that clay lump they would impress all the necessary official seals just as before. Once the clay hardened, the document was locked in place. To read it, you had to break the seals. This clay lump, now securing an external document, is called a bulla in a broader sense, and we find thousands of them. The string impressions left in the clay are still visible today, a ghostly trace of the papyrus or leather that turned to dust millennia ago. This was a monumental leap. It meant the secure, verifiable envelope was no longer just a container for simple accounting tokens. It had become a universal locking mechanism for information itself. The clay did not need to hold the message anymore, it just needed to certify and protect the medium that did. This adaptation proved the system's fundamental power. It was not about clay or tokens, it was about creating an unbreakable link between authority and information, regardless of how that information was stored. The sheer scale of this administrative revolution becomes breathtakingly clear in the ruins of a single city. In the sacred Ina district of Uruk, the religious and economic heart of one of the world's first great urban centers, archaeologists have uncovered a staggering testament to this system. The ground here is not simply littered with broken pottery. It is layered with the hardened evidence of a bureaucracy in motion. Thousands upon thousands of clay bullae, both intact and shattered, were found alongside the earliest known clay tablets. This was not a trash heap, but a filing room turned to stone by time. The density of these finds is overwhelming, a physical echo of the relentless daily activity that fueled the temple's existence. Every broken half of a bulla represents a single verified transaction, a tax jar delivered, a wool shipment received, a worker's ration distributed. Multiply that by the thousands found in just one precinct, and you begin to grasp the magnitude. The Ina temple complex was not just a place of worship, it was a colossal economic entity managing vast estates, herds, and workshops. To coordinate this, it needed a flawless memory. The bullae and the tablets that evolved from them provided that memory. They transformed the temple's operations from a matter of fallible human recollection into a precise, auditable science. Here, at the very dawn of writing, we see the system not as a theoretical concept, but in relentless, practical use. The number of records is so vast it tells us something profound. The technology was not a special tool for rare occasions. It was the essential, mundane backbone of power. Every piece of grain, every liter of oil, every day of labor was accounted for, sealed, and verified, building an empire not on faith, but on an unbroken chain of clay. But who truly owned this brilliant system? The answer lies in a partnership as old as civilization itself. The clay envelope was almost certainly born in the bustling, competitive world of private merchants. These were individuals whose survival depended on making deals stick across impossible distances. They needed a tool to enforce promises between themselves, to solve the immediate, practical problem of a caravan driver's honesty. The Bulla was their invention, a piece of entrepreneurial genius forged in the fires of commerce and risk. It gave them a private language of trust, yet the moment the temples and palaces saw it, they recognized something far greater than a trade receipt. They saw the key to governing an empire. What began as a tool for personal profit was seized and scaled into an instrument of state control. The private sector solved the problem, and the public sector perfected it, building an entire bureaucracy atop that simple lump of clay. This synergy is the hidden engine of early civilization. The merchant's drive for wealth created the innovation, and the state's hunger for order provided the scale and authority to standardize it, to turn a clever trick into the law of the land. One could not have flourished without the other. The merchants needed the state's roads and relative peace to trade, while the state desperately needed the merchants' goods and their clever systems to manage its own vast wealth. The Bulla sits at the exact intersection of these two forces, a humble object that channeled private ambition into public order, proving that the most enduring technologies are often those that serve both the individual's desire for gain and the empire's need to know exactly what it owns. For decades, these broken clay spheres sat in museum drawers, labeled simply as sling bullets or gaming pieces. They were curiosities, not keys. The true meaning of the Bulla was a silent code, a system whose logic had been utterly forgotten. Unlocking it required a detective who could see connections where others saw only fragments. That detective was an archaeologist named Denise Schmandt-Besserat. Her work began not with the Bullae themselves, but with those even smaller, stranger objects found by the thousands at sites across the Near East, the tiny clay tokens. She noticed a fascinating pattern. For thousands of years, from around 8000 BC to 3000 BC, the shapes of these tokens remained remarkably consistent. A cone always seemed to represent a small measure of grain. A sphere always meant a jar of oil. It was a stable, universal language of commerce that spanned millennia and crossed countless cultural boundaries. But then, around the time the first cities arose, something changed. The tokens began to appear inside something else. They were found sealed within those enigmatic hollow clay balls. Schmandt-Besserat proposed a revolutionary idea. These were not separate puzzles. The tokens, the Bullae, and the first clay tablets were all chapters in the same story. She argued that the tokens were the original three-dimensional accounting system. The Bulla was the invention that secured that system, turning loose counts into tamper-proof contracts. And the impressions left on the inside of broken Bullae were the direct ancestors of the marks on the earliest clay tablets. It was a theory that connected the dots across thousands of years, showing a clear, logical evolution from physical object to symbolic record. Her reconstruction revealed a silent system of administration that functioned perfectly for centuries before a single written word was ever composed. This was a world that thought in shapes and sealed them in clay, a world where the concept of a contract, of proof, of an audit trail, was fully formed long before the alphabet. The genius of the ancient Mesopotamians was not that they suddenly invented writing out of nothing, but that they had already built a complete framework for economic truth, a framework that writing simply stepped into and began to fill with words. The Bulla was the missing link, the prototype that made the very idea of permanent records not just possible but necessary. This idea of sealing truth in clay did not stop at the borders of Mesopotamia. The fundamental problem of securing goods and verifying authority was a universal one, and the solution of a physical seal traveled along the same trade routes that carried lapis lazuli and cedar wood. We see echoes of the concept across the ancient world, adapted to local materials and needs. In Egypt, for instance, administrators used a different approach. They would seal the stoppers of storage jars and the doors of granaries with lumps of clay or mud, pressing a carved stone or faience seal into the soft material. These sealings, often bearing the name of a pharaoh or a high official, served a similar purpose: to deter theft and to mark ownership. If the seal was broken, it was clear the contents had been accessed. Yet the Egyptian system, while sophisticated, remained primarily a marker of control and provenance. It was a "do not open" sign from the king, rather than a detailed bill of lading. Far to the east, in the great cities of the Indus Valley like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, we find another fascinating parallel. Their artisans produced beautiful stone seals, but these were typically engraved with images of animals and a still undeciphered script. They were likely used to mark bales of merchandise or clay tags, signifying ownership or the contents of a shipment. The Indus seals are artistic marvels, but they appear less tied to a complex, evolving system of administrative recording. What set Mesopotamia apart was not the mere act of sealing, but the intricate, logical ecosystem they built around it. Their system was uniquely elaborate because it was directly and inseparably linked to the birth of writing. The seal was not just a marker, it was one component in a chain that included the tokens, the envelope, and finally the impressions on a tablet. It was a system designed not only to say, "This belongs to the palace," but to answer the precise question, "How much belongs to the palace, and who is responsible for it?" This relentless drive for quantifiable, verifiable truth, for turning promises into permanent data, is what transformed their clay envelopes from simple security devices into the very cradle of recorded history. The concept of sealing spread, but the engine of accounting that it powered in Sumer was a singular invention, one that would ultimately give their records a voice that could speak across millennia. The clay envelope's core principle feels startlingly modern. At its heart, the Bulla solved the same fundamental problem we face in our digital world: how to send a piece of information across a dangerous, untrusted space and prove it arrived unchanged. Think about the sealed clay ball. The tokens inside represented the data, the actual content of the agreement. The hardened clay shell itself was the secure container. But the true magic was in the seals pressed onto its surface. Those unique cylinder seal impressions served a dual purpose. First, they authenticated the sender, like a digital signature confirms an email came from a specific person. Second, they guaranteed the integrity of the contents, because any attempt to open the Bulla and alter the tokens would irrevocably break that seal. The receiver, seeing the unbroken seal, could have high confidence that the message inside was exactly what the sender intended. This is the ancient physical version of a cryptographic hash. In our world, a hash is a digital fingerprint, a unique string of characters generated from a document or file. If you change even a single comma in the original file and recalculate the hash, you get a completely different result. Sending a file along with its hash allows the recipient to verify its integrity. If the hashes match, the file is authentic. If they do not, the data has been tampered with. The Mesopotamian seal impression functioned in the same way. It was a unique fingerprint of the agreement, physically bound to the clay. Tampering with the contents destroyed the fingerprint, providing immediate, visual proof of interference. Both systems, separated by 5,000 years, rely on the same elegant logic. They do not attempt to make the journey safe. They accept that the path is insecure. Instead, they focus on creating a verifiable proof of authenticity that travels with the message, a proof that is trivial to check but impossibly difficult to forge. The clay seal and the digital signature are both solutions to the timeless dilemma of distance and doubt, one carved in stone and pressed in mud, the other woven from mathematics and electricity. They are different languages speaking the same truth, that trust is not a feeling but a verifiable fact. We will never know the names of the individuals caught by their own clay seals. The broken bullae scattered across ancient sites are silent witnesses to countless personal dramas, to moments of confrontation, denial, and exposure that have evaporated from history. While the system's mechanics are clear to us, the human stories within it remain a profound mystery. What specific fraud was uncovered when a merchant broke open a Bulla to find fewer tokens than promised? Did a caravan driver protest his innocence as the shattered clay was held before him? Was a temple official dismissed in disgrace when his sealed count failed to match the grain in the royal granary? These intimate scenes of discovery and consequence are lost to us, the emotional texture of justice and disgrace smoothed away by time, leaving only the physical evidence of the system at work. Even the language of the tokens themselves holds unanswered questions. We understand the general meanings: a cone for grain, a sphere for oil, but how universal was this code? Could a merchant from the city of Ur travel to distant Susa and be certain that his trading partner interpreted a specific disc-shaped token the same way? While there was remarkable consistency across Mesopotamia, subtle regional variations almost certainly existed. A token that meant a certain quality of wool in one city might have indicated a different measure or product in another. This potential for misunderstanding hints at a world not of perfect uniformity, but of negotiated meaning, where merchants had to establish common ground before they could ever seal a deal. The Bullae standardized the process of making a promise, but the precise definitions locked inside may have required a shared commercial culture built through years of interaction and trust. The greatest lingering mystery is not about the failures the system caught, but about the trust it ultimately fostered. Each broken bulla represents a moment where the technology worked, where a discrepancy was found and presumably resolved. But for every broken seal, there must have been thousands of deliveries where the clay ball was shattered. The tokens matched the goods perfectly, and the transaction concluded with a handshake and a sense of satisfied order. Those successful moments, the quiet backbone of empire, are invisible in the archaeological record. We see the evidence of the system's enforcement, but not its everyday success. This is the true legacy of the clay envelope. It created a framework where verification was possible, which in turn made broader, more ambitious cooperation feasible. It allowed strangers to do business not because they believed everyone was honest, but because they had engineered a world where dishonesty became a measurable, provable risk. The human dramas of greed and fear played out within its walls of clay, but so did the quieter, more monumental story of a civilization learning to build an economy on proof, one sealed promise at a time. The journey from a suspicious merchant to a functioning empire was paved with hardened mud. What began as a private solution to a caravan driver's dishonesty grew into the administrative nervous system of the world's first states. The clay envelope was far more than a clever gadget. It was a foundational technology. It provided the essential architecture for economics, creating a verifiable chain of custody that turned ambiguous promises into accountable facts. It became the bedrock of administration, allowing a central authority in Uruk to know with certainty what was happening in a granary 100 miles away. And most astonishingly, from its broken fragments, writing itself emerged. The Bulla did not merely record civilization, it actively built it by solving the most abstract of problems with the most physical of tools. It engineered trust in a fundamentally trustless environment. By making fraud difficult and traceable, it lowered the risk of cooperation between strangers. This allowed human societies to scale in ways never before possible, to coordinate the labor of thousands, to manage resources across continents, and to build institutions that outlasted any single ruler. That leap in complexity from village to empire was underwritten by a simple ball of clay. Our history is often shaped by these quiet revolutions, by the physical solutions we devise for problems of human nature. We tend to remember the grand monuments and the epic battles, but the true engines of progress are often these humble systems of verification, the unassuming technologies that tell us we can believe, not in each other's goodness, but in the certainty of the promise between us. The Mesopotamian merchant who first pressed his seal into wet clay was not just securing a shipment of barley, he was laying down a principle that would echo for millennia, that civilization advances not when we stop doubting, but when we invent better ways to prove we are right.